We have the fall in Genesis 3, and then we have sin kind of going everywhere and causing all kinds of problems. And we get to this place where he's remorseful that he even created the world. And yeah, that was, and just all these things happening, and how, the thing that stuck out to me is even when we mess up, God's plan still moves forward, right? We can't stop God's plan from moving forward, which is actually a really great thing, because I wouldn't want to be the reason his plan got stopped. So we're going to see that again this study as we look at chapter 30. So we're going to look at verses 1-8 first, and go through these questions. Verse 1, when Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she envied her sister. Give me sons, or I will die, she said to Jacob. Jacob became angry with Rachel and said, am I the place of God? He has withheld offspring from you. Then she said, here is my maid Bilhah. Go sleep with her, and she'll bear children for me, so that through her I can build a family. So Rachel gave her slave Bilhah to Jacob as a wife, and he slept with her. Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Rachel said, God has vindicated me. Yes, he has heard me and given me a son. So she named him Dan. Rachel's slave Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. And so what do you see here? What is interesting, right? That first part of that was a little bit, challenging, correct? Here, she wants to have children and she can't. And what's her reaction? What does she do? Well, before that, what does she do? She blames her husband. Yeah, she says, it's your fault I'm not having these children. And if you don't give me children, what is, like, it's this extreme, right? She goes to this extreme. What is the extreme? If you don't give me children, I'm going to die, right? And what does that show us about her and what really is important to her? Like, the most important thing to her is being a mother, right? And if you study Jewish history, it actually was taught by rabbis that to not have children was a sign that you were going to go to hell. Like, not being able to have children was a sign that you were not right with God. And interestingly enough, if you weren't married as a man and you didn't have children, it was also seen that way. That's why we believe Paul was married, because to be a Pharisee, you had, like, part of that was being married and having children, because it was seen as such a godly thing to produce another human. And so we don't see it that, like, we're looking at from our point of view, but from her point of view, and in that day, having a child was literally the most important thing in your life. And
so is that throughout the Eastern world taught like that, or was that just with Hebrews?
Well, we don't know, and obviously these are the founding. This is the beginning of the Hebrew people, right? And so these are things that are passed down generationally. But
yeah, but she's from Laban.
Yeah,
he is,
and they're from and they're from a metropolitan place, probably the most established place at that time on earth. But it's just interesting. It's hard, I think, sometimes, because we live in the most unique time in all of history. How long has electricity been around for, right? How long has all these things that we have been? It's like the last 100 years, boom, everything changes. If we lived 500, 600 years ago, we'd be looking at the stars every night. We would be hunting and gathering. We would be, it would be most people's lives would be significantly different, and family would mean something different than it means now. We were talking earlier about Jordan Peterson. One of the things he talks about is birth control has drastically changed our whole concept of relationship, right? The sexual revolution in the 60s, being able to do whatever you want and no consequence of children. But the irony is now on like Harvard or Princeton, you actually have to sign a consent form if you want to have a relationship with someone, right? They have to consent to any physical activity, and they have to sign it, because the irony is they thought they had freed it, but what they really did is restrain it even tighter. They're more Puritan than the Puritans were, because now this whole idea of your psychology is getting involved with it, right? And someone makes a poor decision, They thought it was the right decision that night. The next morning, they hated they made that decision. So they've convinced themselves that they didn't want it to happen to begin with. And so they say it's rape, right? And so now you have this major problem all over our college campuses because of we moved into a place where we thought it was going to be easier, and it's actually a lot harder. It's more complicated, right? It makes it a lot messier. But here, it's so the beauty for me is that the Bible doesn't hide the flaws. The Bible is about God, right, and His perfection, and the fact that He's slow and patient with us humans. Here, Rachel's a hero, and yet we're seeing her flaws, right? And she blames her husband for not having a child, and then she's so entrenched in this view of having a child that she would rather die than not have a child. You know, that's pretty intense. And where did we see that before? Right? Yeah. So Rebecca said the exact same thing. She said, if one of my sons marries one of these Hittite women, I'd rather have been dead. Right? And then what did Abraham say when he went to Egypt? I'm going to get killed if I tell her it's my wife. So these are all yours. Could God protect Abraham in Egypt? Yes. Could He open up and give Rebecca children or have her sons marry the right women? Yes. Could He open up Rachel's womb and we're going to see He does that. But when we kind of try to control it and live in the moment where I'm going to control this and I need it to happen, and our minds get so focused on something, and we think, if only this would happen, if only this would happen. And when it doesn't happen, it's so devastating that we actually go to the point of life's not worth living, right? And today, suicide is at the highest levels it's been in our country, because a lot of people get to that place where life's not working out the way they thought it was. And really, if you think life is going to be heaven, you're in for a big surprise, right? We're not promised heaven here. And I think a lot of people, it's really frustrating when they find out that you can't, because we kind of say speak things, like there's this idea that if I believe it enough, it'll become true. Like I'll be rich and have everything I've ever wanted and everyone will love me. And as long as I believe that hard enough, then it'll come about. And when it doesn't come about, people are devastated, right? And I think the Holy Spirit allowed Moses to record this so that we could have a person we could look at and say, hey, I can relate to that person, because here she was not trusting God, right? She was trying to control her life, and she was devastated about something that really wasn't hers. And I think it's interesting that what does Jacob say to her? Am I God? Am I the one really controlling this? And he almost blames God, but he also throws it back at her and says, why don't you go to him about this and not me about it? You know, go to who can actually control it. I can't control it, right?
A lot of times we forget that God's plan is the author, and we're participants.
Yeah.
We're not the narrator. We don't get to say how it is. We're not even the director. We don't go, hey, this would be better if we went this way. Let's change this.
Absolutely.
We have to follow His plan.
Well, the other thing too is we don't know what we like. You know, we talk about prayer a lot, right? And what if God doesn't answer all your prayers? What's the point, right? But He does answer. He says yes, no, or wait, right?
There's always an answer, just might not be the answer we want to hear.
But I always think of it as like my grandmother used to make these things. It was like it was a needlepoint thing, but when you look at it, it looks like a mess. But when you turn it over, it's this beautiful picture, right? And like that's how life is. What we see seems messy, and like that doesn't, like it's always like when you watch Bob Ross and he's painting, and you're like, you just messed up your whole painting. Why would you do that? And then like a minute later, he does this other thing and it looks absolutely beautiful, and you're like, oh, that's why you did it, right? And that's kind of, to me, how God works. It's just be patient, right? I'm still doing the painting. I'm still putting the things together. I'm still making the recipe, right?
You don't see the signature down at the bottom.
Yeah.
The signature at the bottom.
Yeah. So I think that's part of this, is waiting on the Lord to reveal, and maybe some stuff we're not going to find out until we're in heaven. Because I know Carrie, he came to me and said, you know, why didn't God heal me right away? And I said, maybe God does have a better plan for all of us that we don't know. And part of faith is saying, I'm going to wait. And if you say yes, I'm going to praise you. If you say no, I'm going to trust you. Right. And so that's the mentality He's looking for us to have. Any other mentality is us dictating to God, and as if we know how everything's going to turn out, because we don't. So I think it's interesting. What do we learn about Rachel and Jacob's relationship? Is it healthy right now? Not that healthy, right? It seems like there's some contention. Now, remember, he worked 14 years to marry her, right? It's not like, yeah. So the problem is, yeah, I know. He's like, don't you know I did all this? So after 14 years, they're married. There's this problem. She can't have a child. What's her solution?
Take my servant.
And where did we see that before? Sarah. Yep. And so this is a constant family theme, right? If the wife can't have it, then the maidservant will. And remember, we know that Islam is founded on Ishmael, that this all came about. These decisions have huge impact historically. Something like that, yeah. So slaves. So this is way before Moses. So there's no 10 Commandments. There's polygamy. There's incest. There's. Oh yeah, no. Actually, I think monogamy and like having all what we have today would have been really weird, probably, for some of them, because it had become so normal to have this type of thing happen. Because it's never really confronted, it's never really dealt with. But is it really God's way? No, because he doesn't, like you're gonna see, like there's times when he blesses and there's times he doesn't. He doesn't bless these second off relationships, right? He blesses the core relationship. He doesn't bless the second off or the maid servants or these types of things. The way. Yeah, that's a loaded question, because what is slave? It's not, slave isn't. So we would have indentured servants. Yeah.
Like 9 to 5. Okay, see you tomorrow.
No, so they would be part. He would be part of the family. It's kind of like this. You either be part of our family, but we kind of own you as far as we tell you what to do, or go and die because there's no other options. Like, it wasn't like, hey, you have all these options, we're trapping you and you have to work for us. Actually, it's interesting if you study biblical slavery, that was for many people, they wanted to be slaves because you moved up the order. You moved up the line of, like, if I could be a slave in a rich person's house, I almost get part of their, like, you begin to be part of their wealth and all these things. Like, that was what they did. Parents would sell their kids to rich families. It was a totally different thing. There is places in the world that have it today, but we don't have it here. So it's a foreign concept. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. This was.
Now, there were slaves, like what we would say.
Yeah.
Soldiers. That would be part of the spoils that would take.
Absolutely.
Slaves to sell. And so that would be more of the traditional slave that we're talking about. But I think what servant here, that was more of either the families sending them into another family or them selling themselves through this family to be helpful.
Well, you think too, bartering was a big part of their life. Like, food was a big part of their life. So getting paid, like if you're out in the wilderness, what is coins going to do for you, right? You need food, you need shelter, you need the bare basics of life. So if someone offers you those things and then says, well, you got to do what I tell you to do. Yeah. Well, you get to live, right? I mean, that's the thing. And not only that, if you don't live with them, there's all these other tribes that are going to kill you or make you a slave too. So it's like, it really was who had the power was the ones, and that's what we see here. So, who did Rachel say she was wrestling against? Her sister. So what does that show us? Yeah. So these are things where instead of like loving her, like I think one of the things that we're called to is celebrate the wins of people. And it's hard because sometimes we feel jealous or we feel whatever, but like she should have celebrated a child being born instead of been jealous, right? Or having a child out of spite is like all of these motives are all the wrong motives, right? Like, it wasn't, I love God, I love my family, and I want the best for everybody. It was, I want to look better than you. I want to be superior to you. I want to be the one that everybody loves. I want to be the one everyone looks to. And so whatever that takes, that's what I'm going to do. What is that all about? That's pride. That's puffed up. That's me. Me, myself, and I are the most important thing. And so love is selfless, and this isn't really love, right? And we see this playing out here because it was messy, and it was God using messy people in spite of their messiness, right? That he was faithful, even though we see over and over again, they reveal their motives, they reveal their intentions. She was competing. Think about that, competing with her sister, right? That means she intentionally wanted to do something to make herself look better. And how do you make yourself look better in that culture? Have a lot of children. The more children you have, the more you seem blessed by God, all these things. So pretty interesting.
Like in the last chapter, Leah was flaunting that because she was getting something that she wanted, but what she really wanted was love, but she wasn't getting that from her husband. She was just getting children.
Yes. So we see that again here as we continue on, verse 9. When Leah saw that she had stopped having children, she took her slave Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's slave Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "What good fortune!" And she named him Gad. When Leah's slave Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, Leah said, I am happy that the woman call me happy. So she named him Asher. Reuben went out during the wheat harvest and found some mandrakes in the field. When he brought them to his mother Leah, Rachel asked, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." All right, real quick. Mandrakes were this root that they would pick. It was reddish color, and they believed it would make you fertile. Like you would be able to have babies if you ate this, right? So it was, but this is one of those things like it's a lucky rabbit's foot, or it's reading the horoscopes, or this was using the pagan beliefs of that time, not looking to God to give me children, but looking to some lucky, amulet or some lucky, in this case, some potion. This was like magic. So remember too, this is so important. Abraham grew up 75 years of his life being taught false gods. Like he grew up, his father was a seller of false idols. So he grew up his whole life with this kind of, there's many gods, you got to know how to work the system with the gods. And, there's all these little tricks and potions and mixtures and all these things. And it was man-made religion. It was a man-made thing where if God's not going to do it, if we're not going to look to God, and they may not even know about God, we'll figure it out. Right. And so here that's been passed down. So some of these like very worldly things are still within this family. And we see this. So if you study the mandrake, it's not just like, it's not like we say like eat some kale or, take some vitamins. This was like a magical thing. This was like a mystical, it was like a leprechaun gave it to her, it was not just some, you went to the health food store and you got this nice healthy thing. There was a magical quality to it that would make you have children. So that's important to recognize. So verse 15, but Leah replied to her, "Isn't it enough that you have taken my husband? Now you are also wanting to take my son's mandrakes." Well then, Rachel said, "He can sleep with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes." When Jacob came in from the field that evening, Leah went to meet him and said, "You must come with me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So Jacob slept with her that night. God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, "God has rewarded me for giving my slave to my husband," and she named him Issachar. Then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. "God has given me good gift," Leah said. "This time my husband will honor me because I have borne 6 sons for him," and she named him Zebulun. Later, Leah bore a daughter and named her Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son, and she said, "God has taken away my disgrace." She named him Joseph, and said, "May the Lord add another son to me." All right. You know what's crazy as I'm reading this? Who are we talking about? Who are all these kids?
Children of Israel. Or
The 12 tribes of Israel.
These are the only children that have been born of slaves and these helping out God.
Yes.
That doesn't come back to bite us.
Think how important the 12 tribes of Israel are, right? These tribes break into groups. These are the tribes that go around the tabernacle. These are the tribes that become the northern and southern kingdom. These are the tribes where Judah, the tribe of Judah, is where David comes and establishes Jerusalem and establishes the temple. This is where it all started. Do you see how, listen, the messiness, and they're all coming not from the wife, they're coming from the wife's slave or maidservant. It's like, this is such an interesting thing to see that God took such a messy situation, and yet in the midst of it, like, it impacts us today, right? And it only takes me to the place, like, I always think it's interesting, right after the flood, God says, I'll never flood the earth again. But as men mature, they all become evil. Like, their hearts lean evil, right? And even Jesus says in John 3, when he says, you know, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. If you keep reading, it says, I didn't come into the world to condemn the world, but that through me, man might be saved. But man loves darkness over the light, that his sin would be revealed, that he will not come into the light, right? And that is such an amazing thing to think about, that sin has distorted our desire so much that we don't want, like, we want mess. We don't want clean, right? Given the choice, we take the messy road, not the clean road. We take the broken path. We try to make our own path. Absolutely. And I think the messy road always seems to convince us that it's the right road, right? For some reason, the bad road convinces us that it's the right road. Like, nobody does anything because they think it's bad for them. They do it because they think it's good for them, yet they make bad choices, right? Why? Because at some level, we have a deceiver within us, the sin nature, that leads us the wrong way every time, but we believe it every time. We make best friends with our biggest enemy, right? And we invite them into every area of our life. And this is the same thing that was happening at this time. Like, all of these children, until you even get to this, you know, this last child, which who is who? Joseph. You know, this is the Joseph of the coat of many colors. This is the Joseph, like, that we are going to really look at and say, wow, his life made such an impact, like, changed where they lived, changed the whole trajectory of everything. You know, it's crazy to think about. This is the foundation of all those. I do think it's important to recognize, though, when Jacob first comes to Laban's house, who is the one that he wants first? Rachel. And who is the one that meets him first? Rachel. And in a sense, she's the one that God intended all along. And that's why I believe Joseph plays, like, how many, outside of Dan, how many of the names do you know of anybody? You know, Laban, like, we know kind of them because we've, you know, if you've been in church your whole life, but almost nobody's heard of the 12 tribes, who they are, but they've heard of Joseph and the coat of many colors, right? Even the lost people, because they do these, you know, it was on Broadway, you know, but think about it. They made a story about this guy, and he was born from Rachel, who was doing all this crazy stuff. You know, think about how, like, it's beautiful in one way because God can take such a mess and make something beautiful out of it. It's encouraging that God has grace and patience for all of us. So there's hope for every one of us, but it's also kind of like, wow, you know, it's an amazing thing to think that God has that kind of patience, because sometimes we think of him as like this angry, I want to judge everybody. But the truth is, every time you look at it, he's like, I'm patient and I'm using your mess and I'm giving you a chance to get it right a lot, right?
When we look at the story, it's like God is the most patient thing that is ever around. I mean, because he just sits there and waits. I know in my own life, God done a lot of things to work in my life to get my attention and get me back on the path that he wanted to. But I sometimes think he was sitting up there going, come on, Brian,
Yeah.
when you gonna get this?
Absolutely. Well, and I think when we look back on our lives, we're going to see the patience he had with us, right? And think about it. How much of your life did you do without thinking at all? How many things have you done in your life? You just did it. Like, that's what people were doing. That's like, I don't care. You're like,
Usually all the wrong things that I've done, I did without.
how many times do you say even to your kids or somebody, why did you do that? I don't know. Right? I don't know. I was like, what do you mean you don't know? Because we're all the same, though. We all have the same problem. There's nobody that's like, I don't ever struggle with anything. Everyone struggles with things, right? And whether it's a hidden struggle or it's a public struggle, every human on the earth struggles. That's why we never should be surprised with struggles, because they are part of everyone's life. And only the Holy Spirit and Christ can guide us to have victory in those struggles and to find peace.
Everything in its power to distract you from your direction.
Absolutely.
Everything.
Well, and that's another side of this that I don't, how much is Satan engaged in all of this stuff? You know what I'm saying? Like with even this specific situation, like how much is the unseen taking place? So just interesting stuff. All right, so we're going to continue on 25. After Rachel had given birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, send me on my way so I can return to my homeland. Give me my wives and my children that I have worked for, and let me go. You know how hard I've worked for you. But Laban said to him, if I have found favor with you, stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Then Laban said, name your wages, and I will pay them. So Jacob said to him, you know I have served you, and how your herds have fared with me, for you have very little before I came, but now you're wealthy, your wealth has increased. The Lord has blessed you because of me. And now, when will I also do something for my own family? Laban asked, what should I give you? And Jacob said, you do not need to give me anything. If you do this one thing for me, I will continue to shepherd the sheep of your flock. All right. So what do we learn about Laban in this little passage?
He doesn't serve God. He's not asking.
Yeah.
God for anything.
No.
Now, but he realizes he's becoming a wealthy man because
Yeah.
of Jacob's relationship with God.
Who did he go to find out that God was blessing him? Did he go to God? He went to divination, someone who speaks to the dead, right? He went to like a seance. He went somewhere and they said, oh, you know why you're doing so well? Because God is blessing you because Jacob's with you, right? It's amazing to me that these facts are in here, right? That here Laban he's going it's another like, I'm going to figure it out without God, right? I'm going to figure all this out. And he's almost like a used car salesman, right? Name the price, right? Like, what can I do to get you in this car today? Like, yeah.
He's obviously seen it himself. He didn't slip Leah in there because of a custom. He
Yes.
slipped her in there because he's working out really good for these 7 years. I got to figure out another way to get him to stick around a little bit longer.
And the whole principle, what goes around comes around, and you reap what you sow, right? So Jacob, what did he sow with his father? Deception, and being crafty. And now it's come around, and Laban is being deceptive and crafty with him. And now we come back to now Jacob's trying to be deceptive and crafty. And it's this back and forth relation. It's the same thing over and over and over again. It doesn't change, right? They don't grow, they don't learn, they don't mature. They just keep falling into the same traps. I do think it's interesting here that we recognize Laban was a poor guy until Jacob shows up, right? And now he has all this wealth and he doesn't want to lose it. Like he's found his, he's found the trains come in with the cash. He doesn't want it to leave. Yes. He doesn't want to lose this cash cow. Yes, this is the golden goose laying the golden egg. Nobody's eating this goose for dinner, right? Like we got to keep this thing going as long as we can. So now we see this. This is another one of those interesting stories in the Bible. Verse 32. Let me go through all your sheep today and remove every sheep that is speckled or spotted, every dark-colored sheep among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the female goats. Such will be my wages. In the future, when you come to check on my wages, my honesty will testify for me. If I have any female goats that are not speckled or spotted, or any lambs that are not black, they will be considered stolen. Good, said Laban. Let it be as you have said. That day Laban removed the streaked and spotted male goats and all the speckled and spotted female goats, every one that had any white on it, and every dark-colored one among the lambs. And he placed his sons in charge of them. He put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob. Jacob, meanwhile, was shepherding the rest of Laban's flock. Jacob then took branches of fresh poplar almond and plain wood and peeled the bark, exposing white strips of branches. He set the peeled branches in the troughs in front of the sheep in the water channels where the sheep came to drink. And the sheep bred, and they came to drink. The flocks bred in front of the branches, and the boar streaked and speckled and spotted young. Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face the streaked sheep and the completely dark sheep, Laban's flock. Then he set his own stock apart and didn't put them in with Laban's sheep. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob placed the branches in the trough in full view of the flocks, and they would breed in front of the branches. As for the weaklings of the flocks, he did not put out the branches. So it turned out that the weak sheep belonged to Laban and the strong ones to Jacob. And the man became very rich, and he had many flocks, female and male slaves, and camels and donkeys. This is a nuts. Well, so DNA, people study this and recessive traits and all this stuff, and there is something to be said if, like, even today, if you put certain imagery in front of animals, it impacts their breeding processes and all this stuff. So whether Jacob was like a genius when it came to breeding or whatever, the real point of the story is it's a funny story. If you think about it, Laban's like, all right, name your price, right? And Jacob says something that I think Laban was shocked by. He says, I'll take the he said, I'll take the ones that aren't completely pure, because they didn't want the speckled ones. They were thought of as like, these are inferior. These are not as good. These are not the ones we want anyway. So he had hit the lottery. Jacob was going to stick around on the leftovers, right? The things we don't even care about. Do you know how we know? Because he leaves his sons to manage, and he gets 3 days away so that Jacob can't go back on the deal, right? It's crazy. He gets 3 days away as soon as this deal is made. Why would he do that? Because he doesn't want Jacob to say, no, I don't like this deal, right? But Jacob had a scheme all along, and somehow he knew by doing this weird thing that he did, that it was going to cause him to keep the strong animals, and it was going to give Laban all the weak animals. And in the end of the day, it is exactly what happened to Lot. Remember, you go back to the story of Lot. Abraham said, you pick which side you want to go to, and you take your stuff with you. And within, a couple of days or whatever, he's overtaken in battle, and he loses literally everything that he had taken with him and has nothing. And Abraham goes over into this other valley, and God blesses him, and he continues to be overabundance of stuff, right? Here we see Laban thinking he's made this great deal, when in actuality, he's been schemed. The schemer gets schemed who schemed the schemer before, right? So it's this long line of...
It might be a good way to pay a single debt, but to make it a practice, that's...
Well, and it rings of truth, because I've met so many people, they're like, I used to be good friends with this guy and he schemed me. And then you find out there's more to the story. Well, that guy had schemed that guy before, and there was this ongoing back and forth kind of... This is what happens when you don't build relationships on truth. This is what happens when you don't have character. This is what, like, in the end, if you lie, you'll get caught. If you steal, you'll get caught. If you cheat, you'll get caught. Or something will happen and it won't work out the way you want it. I always tell people, if you steal, you're stealing from yourself, because all of the prices are going to go up. And then you're paying, you can't steal everything all the time. So you're going to have to pay for stuff. And now you're losing all that money because you stole the money. They had to increase all the costs, right? Look at insurance. All that stuff is so broken. And a lot of it is because of, lawsuits that are frivolous, right? All of these things break the system. And that's why, when we come back to this principle, humans are not basically good. Our tendency is to lean bad, right? Even the good ones. Like, we're all capable of doing really bad. right? It's a miracle that we do any good. And it's only by, I believe, by the Holy Spirit of God that any of us can do good, because he's the one leading us into those good things. But this is a story I think you could say happens anytime, any place in the history of the world, right? Relatives scheming each other. And then what does this ultimately lead to? Broken families, broken relationships, hurt feelings, broken hearts. You know, instead of a joyful, loving family, you have this shredded family. Why? Because someone felt like they could take advantage of something they shouldn't have tried to take advantage of, right? And that there's choices and consequences, and those consequences can be lifelong, right? And that's happening here. And yet, in spite of all of that, has God's promises been deviated at all? Has his plan been changed? No. The truth that Jesus is coming is still moving along just as he had planned it all along, right? And Jacob isn't blessed because Jacob is good. Jacob is blessed because God is good. And that's the difference, right? Because you can read this story and be like, well, if I do good, then God will bless me and give me a bunch of sheep, right? But that's not really what's being said here, right? God's plan was he was going to bring a deliverer, and Jacob was in the line that he was going to do that through. So it wasn't the greatness of Jacob, it was the greatness of God and his plan, and Jacob just happened to be part of his plan, right? And that's where I think humility, gratitude, when we recognize it's not because I'm super special, it's because God is special. Like, God is the wonderful, glorious thing. Anything good in me is because of him. And any blessing I have is because of him. And helping others then becomes part of that whole, what you're to do and how you're to live.
And just because the behavior is in the Bible doesn't mean that we have to emulate that in our lives. A lot of things are put in there, especially like with Abraham, Jacob. They're in there because they're a terrible example of what we need to be doing.
Absolutely. So one other thing I want to point out, and I didn't have it here in the study, but I think is really interesting. Matthew chapter 19. This is what Jesus says to his disciples, and it's verse 29. Verse 28 through 30. Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, in the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." Right? So who is he talking to? The 12 disciples. And he's saying, you have followed me, and you're going to sit on 12 thrones, and you're going to judge the 12 tribes of Israel. So to me, this is that, the Old Testament is a mystery concealed. The New Testament is a mystery revealed. And the full story can only be when you have both of them together. You have only half the story if you have New or Old Testament. And here you have the full story. I've always wondered, what is the connection between the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 disciples? Like, what kind of guys were the 12 disciples? What kind of guy was Peter, right? What kind of guy are any of them, right? Were any of them like the guys anyone else would pick? No, they were messy fishermen, probably didn't have the greatest language, probably had a lot of, issues, just were not liked in their communities. They were rough around the edges, and yet they're the 12 out of all the humans that have ever lived. They're the 12 picked to be Jesus's disciples. Not one of them is a Pharisee or a teacher of the law. Not one of them is a rabbi. Not one of them is what we would pick. If you're going to pick Jesus's closest followers, you're going to pick somebody that at least knows the Torah really well. And yet these guys are just regular, probably outcasts in some way, right? And yet now you look back and you see the first 12 and how they came into existence. And you're like, that was messy, and that was broken, and that was not clean, and that's not how if you were to write the Bible, if you were to make it up, you would say, and this, King Jacob and Queen, and they were so wonderful, and they had this beautiful love, and they married each other, and then they had 12 beautiful sons, and each one of their sons had a different superpower, and and they represent the 12 tribes of Israel, and that's why the 12 tribes are so important. No, the truth is God used them in spite of them. he did his work with messy people, not clean people. He did his work best with the broken, not the people who thought they were not broken, right?
Bible stories, myth. I'm like, why would you make this up? I mean, this always started out with the best and the brightest, or somebody becomes the best and the brightest, you know?
But that also, for me, it's like as a church, we should want the roughest looking people coming in and being a part of it. We should want the people that have the most messy lives. Like, we should recognize that's what Jesus was about, right? I mean, from the very beginning, the people that were most in tune to the Spirit of God were the people with the biggest messes in their life, right? And I remember Jesus says, they're having this discussion about the prostitute, and he says, those who sin greatly can also love greatly, right? That the depth of your sin, they recognize what sin is much better than the person that maybe thought they were righteous their whole life, right? And there's something to be said about when Christ redeems someone that was really far away from him, right? That's such a powerful act. And that person may, because they went that far away, now recognize what it means to be that far away. And they have that much more love for the Father, right? And so to me, like, trying to make it all all clean and not messy and try to make sure church should be messy at some level, right? Because people are messy, and it's the Holy Spirit entering into that mess and making something great out of it, right? Yeah, like the family, the addiction, the addiction's there, but something happens in the addiction, like the Holy Spirit is helping that person and overcome that addiction, right? That they don't stay where they are. And like, that's the thing here, is like all of these stories about people that God did something great with, even in spite of their bad decisions, right? And family issues, right? And all these things that could have gotten in the way didn't get in the way. So to me, that's the encouragement. That's what we need to remind ourselves regularly of, and not lose heart. And, you know, if I would have been Saul's brother growing up, right? Like, there's no way Saul's ever becoming a Christian. That guy hates Christians. That guy's putting Christians to death. That guy's whole life is committed to hunting down Christians. There's no way ever that guy is going to become a Jesus follower. And yet he becomes the greatest Jesus follower of all time and writes most of the New Testament, right? So for us to ever think that there's a person that's too far lost, or actually, to me, if the further lost they are, maybe the closer they are to turn around, right? They've gone far enough to realize they're not going anywhere. So pray for people, don't give up on people, and recognize the only way family works, the only way relationships work, the only way any group works is if we submit humbly to God. When we try to control, when we want to be better than other people, we want to be the spotlight, it always produces mess. It always produces problems and hurt and pain. And so that's another important reality to think about and to consider. So questions to consider: do you trust God when things are not working out the way you want in life? Right? Trust is what is the greatest recipe in love, is trust and sacrifice, right? Those are the two most important things I believe in love, is trusting and sacrificing. And so part of loving God is trusting him even when you don't understand exactly why things are happening. Do you trust God with your family? Do you manipulate people, or do you feel manipulated? Right? Because this story is all about manipulation, isn't it? It's Rachel manipulating Jacob. It's Jacob manipulating Laban. It's Laban trying to manipulate Jacob. Like, it's trying to control other people for your own desires and wants, and not loving them, and being patient and kind to them. Do you have unhealthy relationships? Application: thank God for all he has done for you. Confess any sin in your life. Ask God for guidance and wisdom. Trust God with the outcome. I think to me, that's the ticket. That's like the big thing, is patiently allow God to determine the outcome. Wait on the Lord. Those who wait on the Lord will be renewed, right? He will uplift your spirits. He will provide. He will take care of you. It's when we don't wait on the Lord is when we get into trouble, right? And even you guys this week, one door closes, 10 minutes later, a new door opens, right? You never know It's the boiler. It's it's not comfortable, and it's painful, and there's so many times you don't want to go through, but then you realize without that stretching, you would never become who you are, right? Without that pain, you'd never get stronger. Without that struggle, you'd never be able to see the world properly. So all those things.
Talk about Paul. He got James traveling down. He's going to establish churches here there to talk. And he gets thrown in jail.
Yeah.
And he's like, what the heck?
Yeah.
This wasn't my plan.
Yes, absolutely.
I had planned to go down there.
I know.
Speak to the people. And what did he do in jail? He wrote
Absolutely.
words
That we're reading today.
millions of people
I know.
read.
Well, and the other thing, Paul could never have known that he was going to go before all of the leaders of his day. Like, because he was in jail, he was then put in front of all the top leaders, and they would just push him on to the next leader and push him. So God used his imprisonment to allow him to share the gospel to the most powerful people in that part of the world.
But it was so much enough.
That would have never happened. No, absolutely. Absolutely. I know. And that's why it comes back to, am I willing to accept where I am, even if I don't like it? Right?
That's such a great look at it. When we look at Paul, and he didn't try to help God.
Yeah.
We're reading through here. Everyone's trying to help God with the plan.
Yes.
Yeah. Paul just said whatever.
Well, and the other thing that amazes me about Paul on his missionary journeys is he was so in tune to the Holy Spirit. When the Holy Spirit said, don't go there, he was planning to go to Rome. He was planning to go, and then the Holy Spirit said, don't go this way. And he was so, he could hear so clearly the Spirit that he heard it and then he obeyed it, right? It's one thing to even hear and know that that's God, but then also to obey that hearing. That's a credit to him, and I think probably through a lot of pain and
It's a lot
difficulty.
easier to look back and see where God told you to do something.
Absolutely.
In hindsight.
Well, and I think the parts of his story in Acts that are so interesting are when he tells the captain of the ship, don't go because we're not going to make it. And still the captain goes because he thinks he knows better. And then they lose all their food. They're about to die. And an angel has to come to Paul and say, no, nobody's going to die. But don't just trust the Lord right now. But think about, in that case, he had no authority over the captain because he was a slave. He was a prisoner. He knew what not to do, but he was compelled to go because he had no other options. Yeah. So imagine you know the right thing, but you have no control over the right thing because someone else has control over you, right? And so I think that's even absolutely. That's God putting him to the test, that if he could pass that test, think how strong he is spiritually. Think about his eternal.
The ship be like, the FBI arrests somebody.
I know.
Take them to jail.
I know.
And then that prisoner tells the captain, the plane's going to crash if we don't go.
Yeah.
No, don't go. And the captain's going, my job is to fly
I
the
know.
plane.
Well, and it all comes down to the captain he has an authority that's earthly, so there's no way he could have known. Paul had the heavenly captain, but the earthly captain didn't believe that. And that's life. I mean, how many people do we interact with that think this is rubbish? Like the Bible's a fake thing and it's all imaginary and it's a crutch or whatever. So you have to love those people, and you have to, even when their decisions negatively affect you, you can't retaliate, right? You got to just be like, look, God's obviously allowing me to learn patience and grace, because no good's going to come from me fighting this person or trying to do whatever. And so everything in life the beauty to me is everything in life is valuable then. God doesn't waste a single second of your life. Everything that happens to you in life, he uses it, right? And we have to remind ourselves, because we forget. We get lost in the moments and forget that God is allowing this to happen to teach us and train us to be more like him, right? And so, great. You don't think when you're going to read Genesis 30 there's all this stuff, but there's always all this stuff. It's always, I know. When I was reading, I'm like, I cannot believe this is how the 12 tribes of Israel came about. This is not how I would have made it if I made it, right? This is like messy and, this is like what you would see on a daytime, talk show. You're like, what? You did what? So, all right. Brian, would you close us in prayer?
We are so grateful for the time that we have.